Well, good afternoon, friends, and thank you to our hosts for letting me join this fantastic event, and thank you for letting me inside your head. Could we just start off, could I ask you to raise your hands if I am inside your head, either for real or in translation? Okay. Usually when you've spent a day listening to strange voices in your head, it is time to visit a psychiatrist. But I hope you're feeling sane, and may I ask you also to shake hands with the person sitting next to you, to remind yourself you are still in the world of reality and sanity. And there's a reason I'm going to ask you to do something a bit later, which makes it probably good you've met your neighbor. For me, the conversations today have been absolutely fascinating and very similar in some ways to conversations in London or in Los Angeles or Shanghai or South Africa about creativity, technology, assessment, collaboration, all of these things. Now, this may mean that everyone around the world, including all of you, are very brilliant, or it could be we are all slaves of fashion. And because we believe, I think, in critical thinking, that knowledge comes from interrogating ideas, not just accepting them, I would like to ask you all, as I speak, to think about not only what you agree with in what I say, but also what you think is wrong. And when I finish speaking, I'm going to ask you to talk to the neighbor you have just met, your lovely neighbor, and tell them what you thought was wrong in what I said. And then hopefully we get some argument, some dialectic, out of which we can work out what are these things is real, what is useful, but also what might sound promising but not actually be so good. Now, I'm prompted to ask you to do that by a little story I want to tell you about my own past. About 12 years ago, I was working for the UK government. I was in charge of policy for the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair. We had lots of educational policies. We thought we were very clever. We had a policy for everything. And some of them were working, but a lot of them were not working. And they were particularly not working for many teenagers who were basically bored at school. And one evening I was talking to a very old friend of mine complaining about why the pupils would not respond well to our policies. And my friend said to me, "You are so stupid. It's incredible how stupid you are. Just ask yourself one question. Think back to your childhood. What was the moment when you learned most? What were the compelling experiences of learning that most shaped you?" And I'd ask you all to ask yourself the same question. I was a student who loved books. I was quite academic. I even liked writing books. But if I thought back, my most memorable experiences had nothing to do with books. One was standing on a mountain in a blizzard with a group of friends, having to find our way back down. Another was working with a local community to clear an area of ground. And in retrospect, the moments I had learned most were experiences where we were learning as a team, where it was involving reality, where there was something at stake, where it mattered whether we learnt or didn't learn, and where we had to use all the capacities of our minds to solve the problem. And he pointed out to me all of our educational reforms ignored this basic truth, that we often learn most through those sort of situations. I'm going to come back a little bit later to what I think that means for educational innovation. But I'm first going to do a little bit of what it says I would do, which is a bit of an overview of some of the things happening around the world. I come from an organization called Nesta. This is obviously a word in Portuguese, but that is a coincidence. We are the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. We are a mixture of various different types of organization. We are an investor in startups and early stage companies. We do research. We run practical programs. We support skills of different kinds. And our main interest is in innovation. And not just innovations in fields like education, but I'm also interested in the role that education can play in innovation. And after you've had your discussion, I'm going to share with you some absolutely explosive research which will be published next year in the United States about the role of education in the economy and innovation. But you'll have to wait for that. If you look around the world at innovations in education, we are now incredibly well endowed with sources to find out what is happening. And many of you will know these sources. Things like the Center for Education Innovations, the work of WISE in Qatar, organizations like the OECD. There's much more cataloging of innovations around the world. There are some major gaps in how they are cataloged, but it is easier to find out what is happening than ever before. I'm going to just very briefly mention a few of the innovations around the world which I think are most interesting and have most to teach us. The first group are ones which are about very simple, very low cost, but very effective education. In my experience, one of the biggest problems in this whole field is that you find beautiful islands of innovation, incredibly gold-plated schools, which are absolutely beautiful places, but are so expensive they could never replicate or scale. You see them all over Europe, all over America, and they are wonderful, but also in some ways terrible, because they are guaranteed not to influence whole systems. And this is why I like things like Pratham in India, which developed an incredibly low cost, incredibly simple way of getting education to the poorest children in the most remote areas using volunteers, and absolutely pared away any unnecessary cost. I would say the same is true of BRAC in Bangladesh, who are now, I think, the world's largest provider of basic primary education in the world. And it's interesting for me, in a rich country like Britain, we have used Pratham and BRAC to train educational innovators in Britain to help them become more rigorous in thinking about the design of methods and replication and scale. You may be familiar with these. If you're not, it's worth looking at how they've gone about their work and how they've gone to scale. Pratham is has reached nearly 40 million pupils. BRAC is the largest NGO in the world and spread across East Africa as well as Asia. A very different example I like comes from South Africa, the Seoul City Institute, who have, in a way, merged education with soap operas, telenovelas, and with health and development. It's a really good example of thinking of the integration of education with entertainment and community development. Again, very similar parallels here in Brazil, but again, if you haven't seen this one, look at it. Many of you will be familiar with some of the sort of poster child innovations around the world. This is the famous hole in the wall in India, where a researcher now based in the UK put computers in slums without any instruction, and children learnt for themselves. The reality is not quite the same as the story, but it's a beautiful story all the same, about empowerment. There's a huge amount happening, as we've heard today, around analytics and assessment and using technology so we get away from the exam and turn assessment into something which happens every day, every hour, and is visible to the pupil and the teacher and their parents. My own organization invests a lot now in assessment tools like this one, an adaptive learning program, digital assessment, ways of making every aspect of education, as I said, real-time feedback to help people improve and to tailor their learning to how they learn best. What may be less familiar to you is the role of open data in education, and I don't think we have discussed this much today. Earlier this year, we ran an open data challenge where we got the government to open up data from a national pupil database, which showed pupils' performance month by month, and we anonymized it, but then opened up to programmers to link that with other data sets, from housing to jobs, to create new value, to be useful to pupils and to parents. This is one of the winners, called Skills Route, which links together subject choice data with labor market data so that a pupil thinking about what subject to choose at 14 or 15 can see the impact on their future life what they will earn, what kind of job they will get, even how happy they may be in that job. And I think this is going to be a great field of transformation of education in the next few years, opening up as many of these data sources as possible for clever reuse and combination with other kinds of data. And it's one of the reasons why I'm very strongly against proprietary, privately held data in education, because I think that will kill some of the most promising innovation. Another field is the movement to open science, and it's been great to hear some of the examples today of involving young people in science from a much earlier age. This is Zooniverse, you may know, one of a whole range of open science projects in astronomy, in cancer, in plant biology, which are involving hundreds of thousands of children in the reality of science. They're not learning about science, they are actually doing the science, and through doing the science, are learning about the science. And this is a completely novel way of thinking about science, which didn't really exist 10 years ago, but I think will become part of the everyday curriculum. A lot of these innovations are also even permeating through to universities. How many people in this room work at a university? Very few, okay. I don't think universities are always the most innovative places on earth. And I don't know why, but they are beginning to move from the old model of the classic campus, the 3-year course, towards all of these new things like multidisciplinary, practice-based learning. Aalto University in Finland is a great example, I think. The Mondragon Team Academy, based in the Co-ops in Spain, is a wonderful way of learning entrepreneurship in teams. Harvard has created courses now for old people, over 50s, from business to retrain, and you have all the peer-to-peer learning tools, open innovation, beginning to transform what it means to be a university, though I'm still frustrated how slow they are to move and to learn. You will be familiar as well with the distance learning innovations. It's nearly 50 years since the Open University pioneered distance learning. It now has 200,000 students a year, several million in the Open University in China and India. Amazingly, most of the MOOCs ignored all the lessons from the Open University, but that's another story. But we now have interesting things in Coursera, Udacity, and the Khan Academy, which was talked about today. This is an era of extraordinary innovation in education, probably unprecedented in human history. But the question, I think, for all of us is it the right kind of innovation? Is it being organized well enough? And are we making the most of the promising ideas, or are they failing to grow and failing to develop in the right ways? So here's 2 questions to ask. First of all is about fitness for the future. Do any of you know what this research is referring to? Do you recognize these diagrams? So this is research from the US, done about 2 years ago by some British researchers, which asked a very simple question: which jobs will still exist in 20 years' time? And they looked at which jobs will be replaced by robots and automation. In the US, about half of all jobs are likely to disappear because of automation in the next 20 years. And they're not just jobs like accountants, retail salespeople, economists. Half of economists' jobs are likely to disappear. Are any of you economists? You need to retrain quickly. Health technologists, actors, 40% of actors' jobs going. We face a very perhaps turbulent few years as much smarter machines, artificial intelligence of all kinds, will change every labor market. And I think the crucial question for education systems is, are they ready for that? We talk a lot about future skills. This work now gives us some quite precise analytical tools for understanding which kind of skills will actually be needed in 20 years' time. And the pattern these researchers found is one which fits very well with the themes of today. The jobs of 20 years' time, the ones which will survive, probably, this wave of automation, will be ones with creativity, ones involving social intelligence, dealing with other people, emotional intelligence, and also ones with dexterity. Robots will not be very good at many jobs involving hands, whether it's caring for an older person or making things, which is why actually the maker movement is in exactly the right space. But around the world, incredibly few education systems are really seriously thinking about the implications of this for school curriculums, for the experiences of children. So that's question one, readiness for the future. Question two is what works. In all the work we do on innovation at Nesta, we're always seeing wonderful creative ideas, but in every single field, most really wonderful creative ideas are actually not good enough to deserve to be implemented and taken to scale. So any mature innovation system is constantly culling, getting rid of the good ideas, but which weren't quite good enough. In education, this doesn't happen very much. And one of the weird things about education is often not very good ideas spread because they're fashionable, not because they work. So one of the things we've been doing in the UK is building up a much stronger infrastructure of methods of assessing promising ideas. We have a thing called the Alliance for Useful Evidence, which brings together all the people involved in creating evidence and using it and analyzing it. We have a new organization particularly servicing teachers called the Education Endowment Foundation, which analyzes every kind of intervention, shows how much it costs, shows how strong the evidence is, and puts it in a very simple formula of how many months equivalent of schooling does it add. Does it add the equivalent of 2 months of schooling, or 0, or 4, or 0? And we found this a very powerful tool to help teachers and head teachers ask the right kind of questions of otherwise quite promising ideas. This is even more important in relation to technology. I have a background in telecommunications, so I love digital technology, and I start from a belief that, giving every child a laptop is a wonderful idea. But every time we've looked at the evidence on digital education, we find a much more mixed picture. We find huge amounts of waste. We find almost never the technology on its own achieves anything. It's always the technology combined with a new way of teaching, a new way of learning, which makes the difference. And again, it's as if we have to relearn these lessons about evidence. And across the world, there is still no proper testbed for testing out new ideas in edtech and finding out which ones really work and which ones don't. If you're interested in creating one, do talk to me. So with those as the two questions, I want to focus in my final few minutes on two. Actually, let's say this very quickly. This is the framework we have used to orchestrate evidence about education and other fields. And so for any of the things we've talked about today, we would ask where it is on these levels. Is it level 1, where you have a good account of why it might work? Is it level 2, where you have some data? Is it level 3, where you have a control group? Is it level 4, when you've replicated? And we're trying to make this a common language for talking about what works, so we don't just have nice, promising ideas, but which don't actually work. And some others, like Pearson, have taken this further than us, and I think it's becoming embedded into the work of some of our government departments, many foundations as well. So what I want to do is focus in briefly on two live examples which build on evidence, but also, I think, answer the challenge of automation, and also, I think, answer this much bigger question of how do we not just teach children perhaps to have a job, but how do we make them able to shape the world around them? And for me, this should be the animating task of any education system. How do we leave the generation after us better able to make the world a good world than we were? How do we help them not make the same mistakes we made? So, two examples of this. The first is called Studio Schools, and this was really a reaction to my friend's comment about how all our policies were failing. And so about 10 years ago, with a group of teachers and employers and teenagers, we started developing a different kind of school model, which in part was very old and went back to the Renaissance ideas of Leonardo da Vinci, and in part was quite new, and tried to integrate work and learning. So most of the curriculum is done through real-life practical projects, with employers, working in teams, using all the different disciplines to solve problems. This is an example of the studio school in Liverpool, quite a poor city in England. And here the students all work with computer companies, games companies, digital startups across the city. But they work with them not on the side of their curriculum. This is integral to how they learn English, maths, physics, chemistry, and they still have to do the traditional exams, but they're constantly involved in creativity, generating ideas, generating business models, and so on. And they find it much more motivating than traditional education. What pulls this all together is a curriculum model which isn't like the one I learnt with geography and history and maths. It has things like communication, relationships, enterprise, thinking, emotional intelligence, and everything is structured around this curriculum, which we think is the curriculum the 21st century needs. And this has now reached 50 schools in the UK. We're opening schools in other countries. It's been validated. The government is very strongly behind this. Its inspectors have, at first, were deeply skeptical, but have become convinced this is actually a model which works for a large group of young people. Every school has a link to an industry. This is the space studio, linked to the space industry, where the kids work, as we were hearing about earlier today, on satellites and rockets. This is unfortunately not a true picture of the school. This is their aspiration, not the reality. But other schools are linked into engineering or healthcare or construction, but always using that link to an industry not for vocational learning, but in order to provide a grounding for general readiness for the future, readiness to solve problems, to work in teams, to be empathic, problem-solving human beings. And we have very, very detailed analytics and assessment tools which go through every aspect of things like teamwork and creativity with self-assessment, peer assessment, teacher assessment, in very simple but very sophisticated digital feedback tools. The other example I want to very briefly mention is exactly in the same spirit but very different. About 6 or 7 years ago, we did a project at Nesta with the computing industry of Britain and the TV industry. And we asked them, what do you most need to thrive in the next few decades? And we thought they would ask for new tax reliefs or something like that. Instead, they said what we really need is a different model of education where children are learning how to be coders, programmers, and digital makers from a much earlier age. For the last 4 years, we've been acting on that. We persuaded the government to make computer science part of the school curriculum. We funded all sorts of clubs like this one, providing opportunities for young kids from 6 or 7 onwards to learn to code or to do 3D printing with Minecraft, weird Internet of Things experiments, and so on. All with the aim of turning young people from rather bored participants in lessons in PowerPoint and Excel. Our IT lessons were so boring, unimaginably boring. And yet when kids went home in the evening, they were entering the full excitement of the digital world. So we've tried to overturn that, but all with the language of making. How do you make young people not just observers of the world of Facebook and Google, but able to create robots, apps, websites, and so on? And this year, we've worked with the BBC, who've made this their top priority for the year. And they have huge resources linking this into storylines on television, providing easy-to-use tools for teachers and schools and young people, and making this really mainstream. And to me, this is kind of obvious. This is what an education system should be doing. It's learning all the things which are 21st century skills. But what's interesting, this can't happen just with schools. This is a coalition of the big IT companies providing volunteers for the clubs, of the broadcasters like the BBC, the big telcos, as well as the education system, as well as parents. And I think there's a model there which probably will be relevant in many other fields, where we think about education not as a service provided to young people, but much more as a movement, a mobilization of many, many different players to work together. Now, you heard earlier this afternoon about the OECD and PISA. PISA has had enormous influence across the world, measuring maths in particular and science, showing Finland at the top, and now Shanghai, I think it is, Hong Kong and Singapore. Sorry, wrong one. And has scared many governments around the world, sometimes in a healthy way, sometimes in an unhealthy way. What has been happening, though, in the last few years is the people at the OECD have recognized that in the future, what they will need is not just pupils who are very good at maths and science and English or Portuguese, but also pupils who are able to do collaboration and creativity well. This is the first cut they put out a year or two ago for PISA 2015. Again, it was talked about earlier today. The OECD is the kind of organization which can make anything boring, and this looks very boring. I think you'll probably agree. But behind it is something incredibly important. What would happen if these were the rankings for nations? What if in 5 years' time, what Singapore, Shanghai, Finland, Brazil are looking at is not just the traditional PISA maths rankings, but how well does your whole system do in preparing young people to be collaborators, to be creators, to be problem solvers? And I have a hope that this will become a common sense very quickly, and it will throw down a challenge to everyone involved in any education system, mayors, ministers, head teachers. Really, how well do they do through this lens? A very different lens to the one which dominated policy when I was in government, which was very much about top-down targets, testing, and a traditional curriculum. What I think ties all this together is in some ways a very simple idea, as I said earlier, which is that what we need in educational innovation is many, many different things, of course. It is some very simple, very cheap, very replicable, very reliable ways of providing basic literacy or basic maths and so on. But we will also increasingly need innovations which do what it says here, which create a generation who are able to make their own world and take it for granted that they are responsible for shaping the world around them. They are not observers, they are not bystanders. If they are not part of the solutions to things like climate change or inequality, then they are part of the problem. And to my mind, what has most often gone wrong in education is forgetting that, is thinking of education like a factory, like a pipeline, just pumping knowledge into children rather than preparing them to be citizens, to have agency and the responsibility which comes with agency. And all the cool technologies are great, but I will also ask this question of every cool technology. Does it actually leave people better able to make and shape the world? Because a lot of the technologies, in fact, seem to do the opposite. They create dependence, they create passivity, they create addiction. And we need the brightest minds of tech innovation linking in with the brightest minds of education to focus in on this as the primary question of the 21st century, the primary challenge to all of us. So that's all from me. I would like to now ask you, this is very dangerous, to take off your headset and talk for 3 minutes to your neighbor about what you strongly disagreed with in what I said. And we are then going to, I think, convene to have a conversation about what was right, what was wrong, and what next. Does that make sense? Is that okay? Is that being translated? Yeah? And I will wave when you need to put your headsets back on. Okay? Talk to your neighbor. Okay. Can I ask you to put your headsets back on? Could you please put your headsets back on? Could you raise your hands if you have your headset on? Raise your hands if you have your headset on. And silence descends on the room. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. So I'm now going to ask someone to say something, to share their conversation. Can I pick on one of you? Would you like to share your thoughts? I'll hold it. Okay.
In English or Portuguese?
Either.
Either, ok. Nós estávamos conversando que concordar com você totalmente já seria alguma coisa errada, porque ficaríamos sem opinião formada, como se estivéssemos vazio e você nos depositando tudo aquilo como certo. E a gente entende também que quando se compara uma realidade tão diferente que você falou, né, que a gente estava comentando, os meninos da Índia ou de Bangladesh com os meninos que têm total acesso, fica difícil de fazer essa comparação, uma vez que eles vêm de realidades tão diferentes e mundos tão distintos de acesso de informação. That's it.
Okay, anyone would like to put up their hands who would like to share a thought either on what I said or on the day so far, something you really agreed with, or maybe something you think it's important to challenge or contest? We go. So I'll hold it. It's okay.
In English, the question was whether a theme high school lets students reflect changes in their interest. So if you're doing a space theme, as they become interested in software or other aspects, can they modify, or are they stuck in the track that has been decided elsewhere?
It's a very good question. So in designing the themes of the studio schools, we found teenagers in Britain did not want vocational schools. They didn't want to be trapped in one particular route. So the experience of working on satellites or engineering is really just a tool for learning more generic employability life skills, how to work in a team, how to solve problems, how to be creative. And we've tried very hard not to make them vocational schools for the reason you said. Any other comments? Who would like to? You're avoiding my eyes. I will. Sir.
Para mim?
Yeah.
Bom, eu acho que uma coisa que não surge muito nas discussões é falar sobre ética e que decisões, que interesses estão atrás desses modismos que você falou que, de vez em quando, surgem e tornam como fala comum e grandes ondas, seja na educação e em outros tantos. Então, pensar nos interesses políticos que estão por trás das decisões e das ondas, eu não vejo permear as discussões.
Yeah. And the phrase disruptive innovation is a quite odd phrase to use if you've ever thought about ethics. But who in this room uses the phrase disruptive innovation as a good thing? Who thinks it's basically a bad thing? Okay, interesting. Right, who over here would like to share a thought, whether on ethics or practicality, or things you've heard today which excited you or surprised you or you disagreed with? Anyone? Yeah.
Bom, eu queria só fazer você está ouvindo bem, um testemunho, né? Porque nós estamos na nossa instituição implantando o modelo Studio Schools desde o ano passado. E nós visitamos lá na Inglaterra, né? E eles também visitaram nós lá em Recife. E agora, recentemente, eles visitaram escolas técnicas, modelos de escolas técnicas aqui no Brasil. Porque fica o pessoal sempre dizendo que é semelhante às escolas técnicas, o modelo semelhante às escolas técnicas, e é muito diferente. Na realidade, o que o Geoff falou foi sobre esse modelo Create e essa interação com empresas, com empresários, né, com empreendedores. Isso faz uma grande diferença. Então, assim, vale a pena, né, reforço, vale a pena conhecer o modelo e tentar implantar numa escala maior aqui no Brasil.
Thank you. Yeah.
Acompanhando muito o raciocínio do meu amigo aqui, uma coisa que eu acho que é um desafio no Brasil inteiro, e a Studio School vem trabalhando isso, é a inter-relação entre o ensino de habilidades técnicas e o ensino de habilidades socioemocionais. Como podemos conectar esses dois? E eu acredito que o Estúdios School está sendo um grande pioneiro nisso, que inclusive a gente pode estar usando as ferramentas dessa iniciativa para estar desbravando isso dentro das faculdades, que eu acho que é um grande desafio hoje que a gente tem que trabalhar no Brasil. Colocar a mão na massa dentro das faculdades, porque hoje muitos alunos eles saem com muita teoria, porém pouca prática. Eu acredito que a gente pode trabalhar isso usando muito esse método.
Yeah. So two things just to add to those helpful comments. One is, in the studio school model, I didn't mention, every pupil has a personal coach. So the personal coach helps them develop their learning plan, helps them discuss the data and feedback. So I wonder, how many of your educational institutions provide a coach for pupils? Quite a few. Well, would you like to say something about how that works and the challenges of having a coach?
Bom, na escola onde eu trabalho, os alunos eles desenvolvem estudos auto-orientados, estudos autônomos orientados pelos professores, e como eles negociam com cada professor o que eles vão estudar em determinado tempo, eles precisam de um tutor para ajudá-los na organização do tempo, na organização dos estudos, no acompanhamento, né, dos trabalhos, para ver se eles estão conseguindo se dividir razoavelmente bem entre as diversas demandas.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to say is about universities. So for the last year, we at Nesta have been working with Tsinghua University in China, which is probably the top university in China, really applying a very similar model to studio schools, but to university education. So that half of the undergraduate degree will be done through working on real-life practical problems, either in science or in social innovation in the city, using multidisciplinary approaches, using teams, and so on. We could not get any European universities to do this because it was too radical a model, but China is often faster to pick up these ideas, and this is now live in Beijing and Shenzhen in southern China. Now, I promised you earlier I would share with you some explosive new research, and I will try this out because I think it will be very important for Brazil as for Britain. And this research will be published in probably about a year's time. It has been done by a group of the very best economists in the United States and the UK. And the question they've been asking is about the relationship between education and innovation in the economy, the creation of new patents, new scientific knowledge, new companies. And I wonder if you could guess what the story will be of this research. They've done it in a very rigorous way, looking at data sets of school performance, of parental involvement in young people's life, and creation of new knowledge in the form of patents, business startups, and so on. And for the US, what this shows is a very dramatic picture. The young people who are taking part in creating knowledge and science are actually a very small part of the population. They are not the cleverest children, but they are the children whose parents are the richest and spend most money supporting them and giving them experiences of science. And it appears in the US there is an enormous wastage of innovative potential amongst really at least half the population, where children are not being encouraged by their parents and at school are not having experience of scientific creativity. And you see this very clearly in the brilliant book which came out, I think, last year by Walter Isaacson. He wrote a book about the innovators who made the digital world. The people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Noyce and so on. Almost all of them had parents who were engineers and scientists. And so from an early age, these children were observing in the workshop of their parents fiddling with things. They were sometimes amateur radio enthusiasts or playing with primitive computers. And this was the spark which helped these people become the phenomenally successful inventors, creators, entrepreneurs of today. But the important point is that most of the potential to do that is being completely wasted. And I think this research, when it comes out, will throw down a really profound challenge to governments around the world, which is that if you care about social mobility, if you care about equality, but also if you care about economic growth and innovation, then you have to ensure every young person, however poor they are, is from the age of 7 or 8 having some experience of scientific invention, of what is happening in that room there, of making things, fiddling with things, tinkering with things, because that will actually manifest itself in new products, new patents, new knowledge in 20 or 30 years' time. As I say, this research is not finished because they are very rigorous economists. They will check all the numbers again and again. But I think its message will be a strong one. And it will again say what we need is not just innovations in education, but we need an education system which serves innovation in the economy and innovation in society. And I wonder if anyone would like to comment on this, or similar research has been done here in Brazil, and whether this might be a theme for a future Transformar conference. How do you create a school system and a university system which really is serving that goal of democratizing invention in its widest sense? Would anyone like to comment on this? Or has anyone done the research already? No? Or is it just obvious? Or is it obviously wrong? Because it matters. If it's wrong, then you don't want to follow it. I can't see any hands. Okay. It's sort of late in the day. I want to hear just one or two things, some disagreements. You are all much too consensual. Yeah, here we have a disagreement. Good.
I disagree in the sense that I don't think creativity or useful know-how is necessarily only created by scientists. So I think you can have children who aren't learning science or like that, and they become very creative in other areas, which are as important for the world. You seem to make scientific know-how the most important thing, and I don't agree with that. Although I think it's useful, but I don't agree with giving it that importance.
Unfortunately, I completely agree with what he just said. But the research I mentioned was only looking at scientific creativity because they had a measure in patents which was rigorous and quantifiable. But obviously what you say is true. You can be as creative in, social life, running a government, how you look after your family, all of these fields, not only science. But it helps to have some creativity in science as well. Okay, can we have some other disagreements? And I would hope to disagree with your disagreement. Here.
Não sei muito bem se estou não concordando, provavelmente são só pensamentos desorganizados que vão se organizar no futuro depois, mas tem a ver com o que você mostrou ali da OECD, que estão replanejando como vai avaliar o PISA. Eu estou aqui do lado do Felipe Ré, que gosta muito de joguinhos de tabuleiro. E é mais ou menos como se tivesse um jogo que muda as regras no meio do caminho. Agora que o Oriente está chegando, né, como eram as regras do PISA, agora vai mudar uma forma que a Europa já faz muito bem, né, que é os 3 Cs. E eu não sei se isso é certo ou errado, né, mas é o que está acontecendo, estamos cientes que isso está acontecendo.
Now, I know some people here are working on the PISA reform. Kimberly, you are. Is there anything you would like to share about how that's being done, what that will be testing, and how soon will this be part of the reality for education systems around the world?
Yeah, I'd love to comment on this. So Pearson we have the contract for building the frameworks for PISA 2018, and some of our researchers built the frameworks for 2015, the collaborative problem solving, the experimental domain. And so what we're seeing with PISA is that they are really trying to push the envelope on digital learning and thinking about reading, for example. Not just reading comprehension, not the typical ways you think about reading, but critical analysis of text and really pushing some of those innovative ways to think about reading in the next generation. And so as we look to PISA in the future and as we want to advise PISA, I think you can give information to them about what's important, what we see in the classrooms, and how we need to really move our students forward in innovative reading and in some of these experimental domains.
Yeah. Okay, can I ask two factual questions before I come to you? One is, if you polled Brazilian children between maybe the age of 10 and 18 and asked how many of you think you will shape the world around you, what percentage would say yes? Does anyone know the answer to that question? Is it 80%, 50%, 10%? How many young people in Brazil think they are going to shape the world they live in? You have an answer to that, sir? Yeah? A figure?
You asked us if we are able to shape the future.
Yeah.
And yes, I believe we are. And youth in Brazil, I see youth in Brazil very active and really eager to change education, not only from here, but to other places around the world too. But I do believe we need a lot of change.
Yeah. Okay, I should say in my country, it's now at least 10 years since young people were asked to play any role in education policy. Parents play a role, teachers play a role, but I'm afraid not that much involvement for young people. We are almost out of time, but I want to give you a chance to say something. Yeah.
It's actually, I wanted to answer the gentleman behind me here because I think that we need to expand the idea of making as relating only to science.
Yeah.
I happen to come from the design world. And when we think of making as processes of design, you can design services, you can design processes. You have government agencies in the UK, for example, the Design Council, that are redesigning the way the government deals with health services and so on. And so this mindset of questioning, experimenting, prototype, creating doesn't need to apply only to science. And it's something really important to teach the kids if they want to design a better society in general, not just science.
Again, I would agree really strongly with that. And we've used the word making because it has so many rich meanings. Making is partly about things. And I think it's interesting how we are going back to manufacturing and remaking the physical world around us, our chairs, our glasses, our computers, where probably 20 years ago we assumed we wouldn't be making anything. We would only be buying from someone else. But as you say, making means much more than that. It's making your world, it's making your relationships, it's making the institutions you are part of, like a school or like a city. And we find it's a very good word. It does a lot of work in terms of meaning, which is why, the BBC program is called Make It Digital, but it's really about making in a much broader sense of the word. So I think I'm being told to shut up, which is probably a good thing, because I'm all that stands between you and sanity and pleasure and talking properly to other people. I hope I've at least got across some sense of two or three things. One is the extraordinary fertility of innovation happening across the world at the moment. As I said, probably unprecedented. I hope I've also got across my anxiety that there's actually not enough evidence and assessment of the innovations, and we need to become a bit more rigorous in asking questions, interrogating the promising ones and asking if they really do work. And then we also need to make sure we are innovating on the things that matter, which will be much about empowerment and democracy and ability to shape the world, as they will be about learning technical skills of doing an Excel spreadsheet or knowing, the causes of the Russian Revolution. But that may all be obvious to you. And I guess that's what Transformar is really about, is how, and maybe this is my final point before I hand over to Dennis, so you're going to say something. How do you co-evolve an education system and a society? You don't want an education system to drive your society, and a society can't drive an education system. But in a way, all the ideas which have been spread around today are ones which should be part of daily life and not just about education. And that's what I think is interesting about the next phase. Literally everything we have talked about could apply to a health service, could apply to a municipality, could apply to a company. Every company can become like a university, for example. And that is a very different way of thinking about education than what I was brought up on, which was education policy as about what happens within the boundaries of the school, the college, and the university. And for me, that's a much more exciting prospect, a much more energizing prospect, and maybe a much more transformative project. Thank you.